We are now in the second episode of Alexander's Conquest, the Battle of Granicus. So yeah.
After his tentative enthronement in 336 BC, a 20-year-old Alexander the Great ruthlessly consolidated power in Macedon and securing the allegiance of prominent nobles. That done, the up-and-coming Argead monarch spearheaded daring expeditions in the north, south and west, before finally obliterating Thebes as an example in late 335. With Macedon's borders secure and his royal authority unquestioned, the stage was set for Alexander, tutored by Aristotle in the Homeric epics, to finally turn his glory-hungry gaze eastward.
I had heard that Alexander the Great was a huge fan of the Iliad. He even kept the annotated book from Aristotle, I believe, and that he really idolized Achilles in particular, and wanted, I believe, even claiming he was descended from Achilles. I even heard that when he went to Troy, he visited the supposed tomb of Achilles. So yeah, Alexander was huge on the Iliad, and you can kind of see that in terms of glory, his personal prowess and bravery, almost like a real-life Homeric legend, Well, not almost, he is kind of a real-life the legend, like Iliadic character, I guess. So yeah.
He would use the lethal army inherited from Philip II to invade Persia, a massive 3-century-old dominion, almost 50 times larger than his own. Welcome to the second video in our series on Alexander the Great, and his first clash with Darius's armies at the river Granicus. Alexander was always, after leaving behind him the smouldering pile of rubble that was now Thebes, Alexander the Great returned to Pella and gathered all the Macedonian magnates. Together, they began planning the invasion of Persia. During this meeting, the king's advisors counseled him to take a wife and sire an heir before departing. However, either due to political calculations or because his interest in women was tepid at best anyway, Alexander refused this suggestion.
Oh boy, he really should have. I had heard that Alexander probably did have male lovers, or that he was close with even one of his companions, I had heard. And we do know Alexander did eventually have a kid, But yeah, he probably should have done it right here. Just dude, just sleep with someone real quick. We'll pull a random woman. Just quickly get your seat in something before we go, because you may not come back, and we need to settle this succession now, or else, maybe your empire might fall apart, and there might be a war between all your successors if you don't have a solid one right now. So Alexander. Man, that's probably the worst decision ever. Yeah, you need to have a kid quick, bro.
Royal finances were also in a precarious state following a year of non-stop military campaigning, and so the king was forced to turn to his companions and nobles for assistance. The propagandized account goes that Alexander doled out sections of the Macedonian crownlands until the finances of each companion were provided for. One of them, Perdiccas, is said to have asked the king, "But what have you left for yourself?" Alexander replied, "My hopes." What the king would
glory! So yeah, Alexander's too busy on that glory-seeking mindset. No time for siring heirs and worrying about lands.
was doing here, though, as Peter Green bluntly points out, was borrowing money. With the assembly thus concluded and all matters prepared, Alexander, his companions, and the invasion army advanced through Macedonia and Thrace via the route used by Xerxes I in 480 BC, leaving Antipater as regent at home. 20 days and over 300 miles later, the Macedonians arrived in the Chersonese and prepared to cross the Hellespont. However, while Parmenion did the donkey work and used 160 Hellenic League triremes to conduct a complex but unopposed crossing from Sestos to Abydos, Alexander went south and crossed at Elaeus with a small force. According to one account, just as the king's ship was about to make landfall in Asia, Alexander, clad in full armor, launched a spear into the sand and thereby claimed the eastern continent as Spear One land. Making sacrifices to the gods and conducting religious ceremonies the whole way, the king made a sojourn to the mythical city of Troy. Alexander then went north with his entourage, which included his closest companion Hephaestion, and united with the main muster under Parmenian supervision on a plain near the town of Arisbe. As his invasion of the Achaemenid Empire begins, it's worth going over what kind of army Alexander had at his command in 334 BC. It was undeniably the most tactically and technologically advanced military force of the age. However, unlike such greats as Genghis Khan and his enemy's predecessor Cyrus the Great, Alexander hadn't made his own army, but inherited one developed by his father Philip II. Waiting for their enterprising king on that broad plain near Arisbe were 12,000 of the best Macedonian heavy infantry, 9,000 sarissa-bearing phalangites, and a further 3,000 elite hypaspists, otherwise known as shield-bearers or guards in the sources. Whether these crack troops were armed as pesheteiroi or as standard Greek-style hoplites is heavily debated, but it's possible that they changed to fit the situation. This prestigious unit was led by Parmenian's son, Nicanor. Secondary to Alexander's front-line heavy infantry were 7,000 allied hoplites drawn from cities of the Hellenic League and 5,000 hired mercenaries armed in a similar manner, which was still good for the era. To supplement these battle line units were 7,000 Thracian levies from tribes such as the Odrysians, Triballians, and others. Most vaunted of all were the 1,000 archers and Agrianians, expert skirmishers, who were described as the Gurkhas of the ancient world. If one was to also count the 11,000 infantry of Parmenian's advanced force holding the Macedonian bridgehead in Asia Minor, Alexander would have had 43,000 infantry at his disposal. However,
you know, I had always heard that Alexander's army wasn't always the biggest, like, in terms of what, you know, like, I don't think he ever fielded, always around 40 to 50,000, he never fielded, I think, above that. Could be completely wrong, but you know what I mean, like, around that number, he never went to, like, near over 100,000 or so. Very much quality-based, obviously, and, yeah, overall, just very fascinating, I think.
in the wake of minor defeats against
Okay, Philip II had sent nearly 10,000 troops under Parmenion to Asia Minor. However, the Persian generals inflicted some minor defeats on the Macedonians between Philip's death and Alexander's invasion.
Persian generals before the main army arrived, it's uncertain but possible that most of this smaller army was withdrawn to Europe. Therefore, we will assume that most of Parmenian's 11,000 were either already integrated as part of the invasion army or remained behind with Antipater, leaving Alexander's infantry total around 32,000. Comprising the Argead monarch's mounted strength was first and foremost 1,800 hetairoi, the highly skilled companion cavalry, at whose head Alexander would so often charge into the fray. They were commanded by Parmenian's other son, Philotas. There were also 1,800 of the equally skilled Thessalian cavalry, whose reputation for horsemanship almost matched that of the Macedonians, as well as 900 mounted scouts from Thrace and Paeonia, with 600 horsemen from the Greek cities. Overall, disregarding the 1,000 possible bridgehead cavalry, this brings Alexander's total cavalry to 5,100. Accounting for the possibility of some forces already in Asia, it seems fitting to bring the invasion force's total number of troops up to a nice round 40,000. Accompanying the soldiery were auxiliary elements such as siege engineers, sappers, surveyors, administrators under a certain bookish Cardian bureaucrat called Eumenes, and scholars who would study and document the exotic wonders of the near-legendary East. Aristotle's nephew and Alexander's boyhood friend Callisthenes also served as the king's official historian. Alexander marshalled the army to readiness the following day. Then, almost certainly motivated by a mixture of scouting reports and supply concerns, began a march eastwards towards the satrapal capital of Hellespontine Phrygia, Dascylium. Rather than taking the entire army, the king left behind his 12,000 League and mercenary hoplites, perhaps suspecting their loyalty if put up against other Greek mercenaries. Making good time with his core Macedonian infantry and full 5,000 to 5,500 strength in horsemen, Alexander warned his men that looting and burning en route would not be permitted, as this was Greek land under occupation. More deviously, the properties of a dangerous Greek mercenary general in Persian employ, Memnon of Rhodes, were to be especially respected in order to make the Achaemenids distrust him. The Achaemenid Empire was a colossal entity of prodigious wealth, its dominions so vast that the great king, a recently crowned Darius III, did not feel it necessary to deal with such a petty frontier disturbance personally. Instead, several satraps from the western provinces, including Asames, Spithridates, Asates, and several others, mustered their forces and met at Zeleia in May 334, together with Memnon of Rhodes, to take counsel on the incursion. Fully realizing just how lethal Alexander's meat-grinding infantry would be in the field, and aware that the invaders were short on supplies and money, Memnon gravely counseled the Persian satraps not to engage in a pitched battle. Instead, they ought to enact a scorched earth policy, burning crops, fodder, provisions, wells, and even burn villages down if necessary. By doing so, and opening a second front in Greece using the Persian navy, Alexander would have to scurry back to Europe with his tail between his legs. This objectively shrewd advice meant possibly unnecessary sacrifice on the part of Darius's western satraps.
I'm gonna guess they're gonna say no, because obviously Memnon is proposing such a great counter. I believe Memnon also, I could be wrong, it's been like over a year since we looked at Epic Histories, Alexander the Great series, but then Memnon also almost threatened Alexander's supply lines through the sea, and he died untimely, which saved Alexander a lot of headaches, because Memnon obviously knew how to deal, at least, maybe not deal, but definitely knew how to hamper Alexander as portrayed here. He's giving really good advice. Like, he knows what's going on.
Traps, and they balked at the prospect, unwilling to torch.
Again, Scorched Earth is just really effective. We've seen it, used by the Russians, against the Swedish/Napoleon. We've seen it used by, like, Wallachian rulers such as Vlad the Impaler. Like, Scorched Earth policy is really good. It's actually a really good maneuver that usually has hampered many great armies and, leaders. So, yeah, again, Memnon obviously knows what he's doing, but unfortunately, doesn't seem like he's getting support.
Their own lands, and subtly accusing the Greek sellsword Memnon of lapsing in his loyalty, the Persian governors universally rejected the Scorched Earth plan, and chose to fight it out. It's also possible that the satraps were all too aware that the great king had a reputation for scorning shirkers among his subordinate rulers, and weren't about to suffer his ire for no good reason. A number of other factors may have contributed to this choice, such as the Persian code of honor and internal politics. Satraps such as Asates were used to getting their own way, but Memnon, a Greek, owed his high position to Darius himself rather than them. Asates in particular had a reason to distrust Memnon, as the latter held royally appointed estates in his own satrapy. Whatever the reason, the Achaemenids mustered their forces and marched west to a position on the river Granicus, set on facing Alexander. Following his departure from Arispe, Alexander took his smaller, mobile army up the Hellespontine coast via Pacote and Lampascus before advancing eastwards. Arriving on the vast plain of which the Granicus was the standout feature, the Macedonian army was arrayed in a standard preparatory formation with 2 lines of phalangites in the center and the baggage train behind. Cavalry and light infantry screened the flanks and served as reconnaissance troops in front. In the late afternoon, just before the Granicus, Alexander's scouts rode back and informed the impetuous king that a Persian army had finally been sighted on the far side. This news prompted Alexander to redeploy his forces in battle formation, a task he was swiftly able to accomplish due to the battle-ready marching order. However, when the Macedonian army got to the river, its generals quickly began having reservations about the prospect of immediate battle.
Listen, if you've been in a car accident, don't call an attorney.
Lined up atop the steep far bank were just over 10,000 Persian satrapal cavalry from across the empire, roughly twice Alexander's total. Arsames and Memnon of Rhodes led Cilician and Greek mercenary cavalry on the Achaemenid left, flanked to the left by Arsaces and his Paphlagonian horse. Hyrcanians under Spithridates assorted mounted troops in the center, and Bactrian cavalry to their flank. On the extreme right was Rheomithres, leading a contingent of mounted Median troops. As the Persians had ever since their empire's defeat in the 5th century Greco-Persian Wars, roughly 5,000 to 6,000 Greek mercenary hoplites had been raised to serve as the satrapal army's heavy infantry force. However, possibly because they had the same suspicion of loyalty as Alexander had with his Greeks, the satraps positioned this hired unit a mile or 2 behind the river, under the command of a Persian known as Omaris, too far away to take part in the main battle. The rock-hard center of Alexander's line were 6 1,500-strong brigades of the phalanx, led by Meleager, Philip, Amintas, Craterus, Conus, and Perdiccas. To the right of the phalanx were Nicanor's 3,000 hypaspists, and then Philotas and Alexander himself at the forefront of 1,800 companion cavalry, several hundred mounted skirmishers, Agrianians, and some archers. 2,700 Thessalian, Thracian, and League cavalry were on the left under Parmenion. Following the army's deployment, Parmenion rode over to Alexander's position and counseled the king to delay any battle until the following morning. A hasty and most probably failed attack over such an obstacle as the Granicus now, he reasoned, would be a fatal blow to the entire expedition. However, if they waited until morning, the Persians, observing Macedonian superiority in infantry, might withdraw from their position during the night and allow an unopposed crossing. Our sources disagree on what the response was. However, most tell us that because
is it gonna be no?
of his Homeric desire to achieve heroic status through great deeds, or not wanting to buoy Persian morale by hesitating, Alexander disregarded Parmenion's cautionary advice.
So Parmenion's like advising caution. He's like, yo, Alexander, like maybe we can wait till, the morning. Maybe they'll move. The crossing will be better. But Parmenion, do you know who you're talking to? Like, this is Alexander. He doesn't know the meaning of the word caution or waiting. Now, he wants to go for it, right? Like, he is audacious and bold. Like come on, Parmenion. You're giving great advice. It's actually really good advice, but you're talking to the wrong man here.
And prepared the army for an immediate attack. Clad in magnificent armor on the right wing, he was easy for the enemy to see, and so a number of elite contingents under the satraps shifted to oppose Alexander's elite Hetairoi hammer, hoping to kill him and end the incursion. The Battle of the River Granicus finally began when the Macedonian king sent a mixed vanguard of prodromoi mounted skirmishers, Paeonian light cavalry, and a small unit of companions, and his Agrianian favourites into the river, with the outward aim of securing the far bank. However, facing some of the best Achaemenid cavalry from the treacherous and slippery riverbed, they met predictably stiff resistance. Throwing spears and other pinpoint-accurate missile weapons rained down on the beleaguered advance force, causing terrible casualties from a distance. Some of these satrapal units descended to meet the Macedonian vanguard in melee combat in the riverbed itself, removing them from the advantageous higher bank. This attack gradually drew in even more regiments from the otherwise unengaged Persian line, disrupting the orderly formation on Orestes' left and shaping the battlefield to Alexander's requirements. With the enemy drawn out and exposed by the sacrifice of his vanguard, Alexander charged wholesale at the head of just under 2,000 companion cavalry, arrayed as it was in a wedge formation. Galloping into the river obliquely to the right of the advance force, and thereby meeting little resistance, the Hetairai and their king were able to swing left and crash straight into the exposed Persian left wing in the riverbed, where most of the enemy leaders were fighting. This struggle against the
That was such an interesting maneuver on Alexander. He sent, that group out, mainly, I'm not sure if he just said it was intended to, but obviously kind of sacrificing them, making sure that they get the brunt force, luring a lot of the enemy towards them so Alexander can move, and fall upon them. That's just really... Yeah, I mean, that risky, this whole thing is risky, to put it nicely, and if it had been anyone else, I'd be really worried, but this is Alexander the Great we're talking about, the man, say no more, right? So this all works out.
Best Achaemenid cavalry was, as Arrian relates, a cavalry battle with, as it were, infantry tactics, horse against horse, man against man, locked together. The Macedonians did their utmost to thrust the enemy once and for all back from the riverbank and force him into open ground, while the Persians fought to prevent their landings and hurl their opponents back into the water. The companions' discipline, skill, and armament rapidly began to turn the tide. In particular, the Macedonians' efficient use of the cornel-wood cistern lance compared to the lighter spear of the Persian cavalry. However, despite this gradual forcing of the Granicus on the Persian left, Alexander, in the thick of the fighting, became the target of a concerted effort by the Persian leadership to kill him as the spear tip of his forces pushed their way onto the far bank.
I always admired Alexander was always in the thick of it. He threw himself in the battles. He was known to fight alongside his men, which I admire, and I think everyone else does, but it's also super risky, and you could almost say reckless, right? To a degree, in that his life is on the line. If he dies, as we see when Alexander does die, everything falls apart, right? The Greeks will immediately rebel. No one will be able to just take the reins. We would have kind of like just a Diadochi-esque situation, but on a much, obviously smaller scale if he were to die right now. Because it would just be a complete mess. He alone was keeping everything together. So his life was the most important, on his side, obviously. So the fact that he went for, over, a decade, a lifetime of fighting in the front, not being afraid. He also took injuries, and somehow not died from that is insane. But obviously a huge cause of concern as well.
Accounts differ as to the nature of this clash, but Arrian informs us that at some point after Alexander's retinue penetrated the line, his spear snapped and he was forced to get a new one from a bodyguard. Isolated on the far bank with just a few companions, the king was quickly beset by several contingents of enemy cavalry. The leader of one, Darius III's son-in-law, Mithridates, was slain when Alexander wheeled around and drove his newly gotten spear into the Persian's face. It was only a moment later that...
spear to the face sounds awful. Ew.
Another Persian aristocrat, Rosakes, confronted Alexander and lopped off a part of his helmet before himself being felled by the king's lance. While locked in mortal combat with Rosakes, the latter's brother, Spithridates, satrap of Lydia, bore down on Alexander from behind and...
Yeah, this is where Black Cletus, right? I don't think if I pronounced that correctly, but Black Cletus shows up and saves Alexander by slicing the dude's arm off.
Prepares to deliver the coup de grace. The Persian sword was about to fall, and end the 22-year-old king's life. However, at the last possible moment, an officer known as Cletus the Black swept in and severed Mithridates' arm at the shoulder, saving Alexander the Great's life.
That's what I'm talking about. Oh, wait, let me get rid of the stupid ass. That's what I'm talking about. Like, he could have died right. Imagine the first battle of this war with the Achaemenid Empire. Alexander died right there. He was that close. You know, fortunately he was saved, but that's what I'm talking about. That is terrifying. Like, Alexander went out, you know, in probably an unglorious-esque way after. You would have thought the dude would have died in like over 10 years of campaigning, but no, it's like, you know, either alcohol poisoning or just regular poisoning or whatever got him, you know, point is, that's what got him instead of all these near-death constant battles. Again, this could have been the end right here of everything. Wow.
Point, having inflicted fearsome casualties and cut down many Persian commanders, the companions were getting the better of the Persian cavalry all across the right wing. Furthermore, the Agrianian skirmishers managed to breach the Persian formation's integrity and get in among the beleaguered enemy horsemen. As this hinge point on Alexander's right was being hotly contested, Parmenian's wing was charged by Rhiomithres' Bactrians and Medes, but managed to resist the assault. In the center, 6 taxius of Phalangites and Hypaspists advanced inexorably across the Granicus, ineffectually showered by the Persians' missiles. When it became clear that the companions had punched straight through the Achaemenid left, the satrapal army broke in a wave of panic reverberating from Alexander's point of impact on the right all the way to Parmenion on the left, who had managed to hold the Persian cavalry there. A number of gallant Achaemenid units fought to the death in the river.
Arsames fled to the capital of Cilicia, Tarsus, and prepared his defense. Orestes, however, committed suicide after the battle, fearing Darius's wrath.
While an equally great quantity, included among them Memnon of Rhodes, used their mounted mobility to escape the field and riot to Miletus. They were able to do so easily because Alexander, Parmenion, and the phalanx, which was now on the far bank as well, didn't give chase to them. Instead, the Macedonian cavalry wrapped around the unengaged and now woefully outnumbered Greek mercenaries on either side.
Yeah, I remember this. And Alexander, basically viewing them as traitors to the Greeks, murders them all to the last man, right?
Circling them while the phalanx lowered their sarissæ for another fight. We're left with no concrete reason as to why the satrap's hired infantry didn't march forward and join the main battle. It's entirely possible that Alexander's lightning assault and victory, which according to Professor Michael Thompson, was accomplished in less than an hour, took the Greeks by surprise and left them with no ample opportunity to react in time. Unfortunately, we can never know for sure, but what happened next is universally recounted. As if all of a sudden realizing their dire situation, and probably believing that a fellow Greek king wouldn't be too draconian, the mercenaries petitioned Alexander for mercy. Rather than granting it though, the Macedonian monarch assailed the Greeks en masse, butchering thousands of them in a hard-fought last stand. Plutarch claims that the king had been influenced more by anger than by reason. But one of those reasons might have been to make the brutal point: if you're a Greek mercenary, do not fight for Persian gold, or you will receive no mercy. Fight for Persian gold.
But he, influenced by anger more than by reason, charged foremost upon them and lost his horse, which was smitten through the ribs with a sword, and most of the Macedonians who were slain or wounded fought or fell there, since they came to close quarters with men who knew how to fight and were desperate.
Or you will receive no mercy. Despite crushing the hired hoplites, Alexander's army took more casualties in this phase of the fighting than it had in the process of forcing across the river. In the future, the king would never again be so reckless and uncompromising in dealing with similar surrendered units, indicating just how much of a toll they inflicted. Whatever the case, about 3,000 were killed, and another 2,000 sent back to Macedonia in chains, where slave labor in the mines awaited them. Between 1,000 and 2,500 of the 10,000 Persian cavalry had also fallen in the battle, together with almost a dozen named higher officers and governors. On the victorious Macedonian side, casualty totals were far lower. Taking into account the possibility of propaganda to glorify the victors, our sources state that 100 to 120 cavalry were lost and only 30 phalangites. However disputable these figures are, the strategic result was not. All of Asia Minor now lay open for the taking.
Amazing.
After visiting the wounded and giving an honorable burial both to his own men and the fallen enemy warriors, Alexander appointed his own replacement satrap for Hellespontine Phrygia, instructed him to maintain the general status quo, and then moved south. Zelaia was taken and pardoned, while Parmenion was sent with a flying column to take over nearby Dascylium, which had been abandoned by its Persian garrison. Then, about 8 miles short of Sardis, the garrison commander and many other leading figures came to meet the Macedonians in order to surrender the fortress, treasury, and the city in its entirety to Alexander. From initial insecurity and near collapse after Philip's death in 336, Alexander had managed, in just 2 years, to crush an Achaemenid army in open battle and occupy one of the greatest capitals of the ancient Near East. But that was just the first step. Far to the east, in the heart of his massive empire, Darius III began raising an equally massive royal force to confront the invading Macedonian king himself. As Alexander considered his first victory from a newly dedicated shrine of Zeus at the Sardis Acropolis, looking out onto the great continent beyond, he had to have known that the real challenge was about to begin. Once again, thanks to Hunting Clash for sponsoring.
And we're gonna jump to that battle next time. I'll see you guys tomorrow in the next part. Bye, everyone.